The question of direct or naive realism, as opposed to indirect or a representational realism, arises in the philosophy of perception and of mind out of the debate over the nature of conscious experience, the epistemological question of whether the world we see around us is the real world itself or merely an internal perceptual copy of that world generated by neural processes in our brain. Naive realism is known as direct realism when developed to counter indirect or representative realism, also known as epistemological dualism. The philosophical position that our conscious experience is not of the real world itself but of an internal representation, a miniature virtual reality replica of the world. Indirect realism is broadly equivalent to the accepted view of perception in natural science that states that we do not and cannot perceive the external world as it really is but know only our ideas and interpretations of the way the world is. Representationalism is one of the key assumptions of cognitivism in psychology. The representational realist would deny that first-hand knowledge is a coherent concept, since knowledge is always via some means. Our ideas of the world are interpretations of sensory input derived from an external world that is real. The alternative, that we have knowledge of the outside world that is unconstrained by our sense organs and does not require interpretation, would appear to be inconsistent with everyday observation. History. Aristotle was the first to provide a description of direct realism. In On the Soul he describes how a seer is informed of the object itself by way of the hylomorphic form carried over the intervening material continuum with which the eye is impressed. Indirect realism was popular with early modern philosophers such as René Descartes and John Locke. Locke categorized qualities as follows. Primary qualities are qualities which are explanatorily basic, which is to say, they can be referred to as the explanation for other qualities or phenomena without requiring explanation themselves, and they are distinct in that our sensory experience of them resembles them in reality. Primary qualities cannot be removed by either thought or physical action, and include mass, movement, and, controversially, solidity. Secondary qualities are qualities which one's experience does not directly resemble. For example, when one sees an object as red, the sensation of seeing redness is not produced by some quality of redness in the object, but by the arrangement of atoms on the surface of the object which reflects and absorbs light in a particular way. Secondary qualities include color, smell, and taste. In contemporary philosophy, epistemological dualism has come under sustained attack by philosophers like Wittgenstein and Wilfrid Sellars in his seminal essay, Empiricism in the Philosophy of Mind. Indirect realism is argued to be problematical because of Ryle's regress and the homunculus argument. However, recently reliance on the private language argument and the homunculus objection has itself come under attack. It can be argued that those who argue for inner presence, to use anti-Revencuo's term, are not proposing a private referent, with the application of language to it being private, and thus unshareable, but a private use of public language. There is no doubt that each of us has a private understanding of public language, a fact that has been experimentally proven. George Steiner refers to our personal use of language as an idiolect, one particular to ourselves in its detail. The question has to be put how a collective use of language can go on when, not only do we have differing understandings of the words we use, but our sensory registrations differ. The reason for continued confusion is that both direct and indirect realism are frankly incredible, although each is incredible for different reasons. The direct realist view is incredible because it suggests that we can have experience of objects out in the world directly, beyond the sensory surface, as if bypassing the chain of sensory processing. The pattern of electrochemical activity that corresponds to our conscious experience can take a form that reflects the properties of external objects. But our consciousness is necessarily confined to the experience of those internal effigies of external objects, rather than of external objects themselves. unless the principle of direct perception can be demonstrated in a simple artificial sensory system. This explanation remains as mysterious as the property of consciousness it is supposed to explain. But the indirect realist view is also incredible, for it suggests that the world that we perceive is merely a pattern of energy in the physical brain inside our head. This could only mean that the head we have come to know as our own is not our true physical head, but merely a miniature copy of it inside a copy of the world contained within our true physical skull. The external world and its phenomenal replica cannot be spatially superimposed, for one is inside your physical head, and the other is outside. The existential vertigo occasioned by this concept of perception is so disorienting that only a handful of researchers have seriously entertained this notion or pursued its implications to its logical conclusion. Arguments against direct realism. The argument from illusion. This argument was first offered in a more or less fully explicit form in Berkeley. It is also referred to as the problem of conflicting appearances. Informed common sense tells us that our perceptions often depend on our organs of perception. If we had compound eyes, as flies do, we would receive information about the visual world in a completely different form. If we had other sense organs altogether, like infrared detectors or echolocation devices, we can barely imagine how things would appear to us. Our current perceptual apparatus is obviously not infallible and may misrepresent objects to us even when in full working order. We are all familiar with perceptual illusions of various sorts. Sometimes we think we perceive things which in fact aren't there at all. A more radical case of perceptual error than simple illusion, hallucination, or perceptual delusion. The argument from illusion seemingly shows the need to posit sense data as the immediate objects of perception. In cases of illusion or hallucination, the object has qualities that no public physical object in that situation has, and so must be distinct from any such object. Naive realism may accommodate these facts as they stand by virtue of its very vagueness. It isn't specific or detailed enough to be refuted by such cases. A more developed direct realism might respond by showing that various cases of misperception, failed perception, and perceptual relativity do not make it necessary to suppose that sense data exist. When a stick submerged in water looks bent, a direct realist is not compelled to say the stick actually is bent, but can say that the stick can have more than one appearance. A straight stick can look bent when light reflected from the stick arrives at one's eye in a crooked pattern, but this appearance isn't necessarily a sense datum in the mind. Similar things can be said about the coin, which appears circular from one vantage point and oval-shaped from another. Pressing on your eyeball with a finger creates double vision, but assuming the existence of two sense data is unnecessary. The direct realist can say that they have two eyes, each giving them a different view of the world. Usually, the eyes are focused in the same direction, but sometimes they are not. However, this response is presumably based on previously observed data. If one were to be able to observe nothing other than a stick in the water, with no previous information, it would appear that the stick was bent. Visual depth in particular is a set of inferences, not an actual experience of the space between things in a radial direction outward from the observation point. If all empirical evidence is based upon observation, then the entire developed memory and knowledge of every perception and of each sense may be as skewed as the bent stick. Since objects with different qualities are experienced from each of the different perspectives, there is no apparent experiential basis for regarding one out of any such set of related perceptual experiences as the one in which the relevant physical object is itself immediately experienced. The most reasonable conclusion is that the experienced object is always distinct from the physical object, or at least that there is no way to identify which, if any, of the immediately experienced objects is the physical object itself. Epistemologically, it is as though physical objects were never given, whether or not that is in fact the case. Another potential counterexample involves vivid hallucinations. Phantom elephants, for instance, might be interpreted as sense data. A direct realist response would differentiate hallucination from genuine perception. No perception of elephants is going on, only the different and related mental process of hallucination. However, if there are visual images when we hallucinate, it seems reasonable that there are visual images when we see. Similarly, if dreaming involves visual and auditory images in our minds, it seems reasonable to think there are visual and auditory images, or sense data, when we are awake and perceiving things. This argument has been challenged in a number of different ways. First, it has been questioned whether there must be some object present that actually has the experienced qualities, which would then seemingly have to be something like a sense datum. Why couldn't it be that the perceiver is simply in a state of seeming to experience such an object without any object actually being present? Second, in cases of illusion and perceptual relativity, there is an object present which is simply misperceived, usually in readily explainable ways, and no need to suppose that an additional object is also involved. Third, the last part of the perceptual relativity version of the argument has been challenged by questioning whether there is really no experiential difference between veridical and non-veridical perception, and by arguing that even if sense data are experienced in non-veridical cases, and even if the difference between veridical and non-veridical cases is, as claimed, experientially indiscernible, there is still no reason to think that sense data are the immediate objects of experience in veridical cases. Fourth, do sense data exist through time, or are they momentary? Can they exist when not being perceived? Are they public or private? Can they be themselves misperceived? Do they exist in minds, or are they extramental, even if not physical? On the basis of the intractability of these questions, it has been argued that the conclusion of the argument from illusion is unacceptable or even unintelligible, even in the absence of a clear diagnosis of exactly where and how it goes wrong. Direct realists can potentially deny the existence of any such thing as a mental image, but this is difficult to maintain, since we seem able to visually imagine all sorts of things with ease. Even if perception does not involve images, other mental processes like imagination certainly seem to. One view, similar to Reid's, is that we do have images of various sorts in our minds when we perceive, dream, hallucinate and imagine, but when we actually perceive things, our sensations cannot be considered objects of perception or attention. The only objects of perception are external objects. Even if perception is accompanied by images, or sensations, it is wrong to say we perceive sensations. Direct realism defines perception as perception of external objects, where an external object is allowed to be a photon in the eye but not an impulse in a nerve leading from the eye. Recent work in neuroscience suggests a shared ontology for perception, imagination and dreaming, with similar areas of brain being used for all of these.